community, as you just noticed in the announcements. So again, thanks for joining today. Our training is called Whose Grown Up Are You? And it's really going to focus on the impact of trauma, the role of a caring adult, and how you can foster resiliency in young people. So my name is Kelly Maycumber, and I'm a program coordinator for the Plymouth Youth Development Collaborative through Plymouth Public Schools. And I'm also a former 6th grade English language arts teacher and love spending time learning from kids. So while some of the information that I share with you today will be from my experience as a prevention specialist, some of my experience is going to be from my time in the classroom as a 6th grade English teacher. I'll be co-presenting with Ed Jacobs today, and I'm going to let him introduce himself when I turn the slides over to him. But before I do that, I do want to take a minute to embarrass him. So I met Mr. Jacobs, Professor Jacobs, as a student when I was at Stonehill College, so back in 2010. And at that time, I didn't know what I wanted to be when I grew up. And he was the first person to teach me about what trauma was and the impact of trauma. He taught me about ACEs, and to this day, he's the reason why I'm working in the field doing the work that I do. So I want to say a quick thanks for that. But also through my work in this field, I've had the opportunity to connect with individuals who are on this call that are always willing to work together around these topics and around this information within Plymouth County. So this presentation that you're receiving today is really a collaboration between all of these groups. So the Plymouth County Drug Abuse Task Force, or the Plymouth County DA's office, the Family Center of Brockton, the DEC Initiative, Plymouth Youth Development Collaborative, and Plymouth Public Schools, the Brockton Area Prevention Collaborative, and also the Plymouth Area Prevention Collaborative. All of these minds came together to make this something that we knew had to happen within the county. So thanks to all those groups, and to Professor Jacobs for, getting me where I am today, or being a piece of that. So the training today is called Whose Grown Up Are You? So this training title, kind of a unique title, came from a conversation that I had with a colleague whose daughter is in elementary school. And she came home with a sheet of paper, and she said to her mom, I have to have my grown-up sign this. And Cheryl, working in the field, kind of loved that she said that, because she noticed that the language was more inclusive for families that don't always look exactly the same. But she also, in that moment, I noticed that you can be a grown-up to somebody even if you aren't directly their mom or their dad or their aunt or their uncle or anyone within that immediate family. So we thought about caring adults, and we thought about the idea of thinking about whose adult are you in your work that you do every day, and really in your life, like what little people are looking up to you and everything that you do. So throughout this training today, we're going to talk about the impact of trauma, and we're going to talk about why the role of a caring adult is so important in a young person's life. But during the second half of this presentation, we're really going to look at how, taking care of yourself and bringing some of these skills into the classroom can really build that skill set for a young person. So you can see the training agenda on the screen. Nothing too crazy. We're going to start with a welcome and an icebreaker. We're going to move into talking about what trauma is and what a caring adult is. So that's more generally like the 101. After a 5-minute break in the middle of the training, we're going to move into talking about how you can foster resiliency within the group of young people you're working with, but how also you can fill up your cup and really translate all of the good things into your own self so that you can be that caring adult for that young person. And then at the end, we want to be intentional about saving some time for question and answer. And then a few just like Zoom, reminders, webinar reminders. This is a webinar and not a Zoom meeting. So if you do want to comment or participate, you can interact using the chat or the question and answer box. We also are recording this so that we can share this information along with other people that weren't able to make it in the county today. So it will be recorded if you want to send it along to your peers or anyone who might want to check it out after. So that was most of our housekeeping information. We're going to start off the training with something, my colleague actually taught me about this, a program or a website called Menti. So it's going to be a icebreaker that we want you to participate in. I'm going to give you about 20 seconds or so to take your phone if you want to participate and scan this QR code. Once you scan it by using the app you would use to take a picture, a link should pop up. And once you click on that link, it will take you to a question where you're able to submit an answer. So if you want to take a second and scan this QR code and participate with us, that would be great. I'm going to leave this up for about 10 more seconds and then turn it over to Caitlin to pull up the Menti answers. Awesome, thanks. So you can see the answers are already coming in. The question was, what word would you use to describe the past year for you personally? So I noticed that potentially some people in the chat weren't able to get through on the link, and that's totally okay. You can feel free to drop your answers in the chat. But if you want to respond to this question, we can see a lot of answers popping up. So already exhausting, stressful, bizarre, rough, garbage, grateful, resilient, long. I like that the word resilience thrown in there, but really a lot of words, at least I'm noticing, Ed, I don't know if you see anything else, but kind of pointing towards maybe a little stressful.
Draining.
Quiet. A lot of time to isolate or be not with a group of people. An eye opener. I think that that's a good word to add on there. We're learning a lot of stuff. Unpredictable. So as you can see, those words are popping up there, and we have a variety of different answers, all kind of leaning towards, a little tiring and stressful, I think. Some words, highlighting that there was a lot of times to be resilient and kind of work on that self-care or filling up your own cup, self-love. We're going to move on to the second question, Caitlin, if you don't mind moving on to question number 2 for us. So the mentee should ask you in theory what that next question would be. And we'll wait to see what some answers are. So this question is going to talk a little more about what the biggest need is that you're seeing among young people that you live and work with. So these can either be your own kiddos or they can be young people that you're interacting with through the work that you do. So what is the biggest need right now for young people according to what you're seeing?
So it's looking like the second link is the same question as the first. If participants just want to drop that answer into the chat and make it to all panelists and attendees, that would be great. And if Caitlin maybe can send another link in the chat to see if that works as well.
Okay. Okay, so we still have answers anyway. So the question is really like, what are you seeing as far as need when it comes to the young people you're working with? Like, what are they in need of? Seeing social connection, social and emotional support, healthy coping skills, support from the schools. Any other answers you might want to put in the chat? Healthy risk-taking opportunities for sure. Grace, yes, just some like patience and, some moments to pause and just be. Love and empathy, I love that answer. Healthy relationships and kind of maybe what does that look like? How do you create a healthy relationship in your life? Encouragement. Awesome. So these are great answers. Ed, did you want to add on?
No, they're right in the numbers, and it's kind of nice to see what other people are seeing. Some of the really good ones there.
Yes, definitely. So all of the answers that you sent over are really kind of what we are thinking of when we think of what young people need. And it's not that they were all necessarily positive things, but it's nice that we're on similar pages in regards to like what we're looking to do for young people in our community. I'm going to hand the presentation right now over to Ed. And Ed, you can introduce yourself and you can go get him.
Appreciate it, Kelly, and I appreciate your kind words earlier. anyone who's ever taught before, to hear those words is pretty amazing. So thank you very much. What we're really going to talk about is probably, in my mind, at least for the last 25 years, the most important thing I've thought about in regards to kids. Just so those of you who don't know, I've kind of been around a long time. I started working as working in a juvenile detention center and a transition home for kids who are aging out of the DYS system way back in the 19th. And that was a long time ago. But one of the things I saw with those kids was that lack of connectivity. And I didn't have the background. And the things I was learning in undergraduate, quite frankly, were not the things I was seeing when I was working with these kids. And so what became pretty clear to me at the time, I'll give you an example. Unfortunately, at the detention center, although I was a teacher there and then became director, occasionally one young man would kind of go out of control and want to hurt somebody or himself, and he had to be restrained. And I just remember on occasion, myself and two other people, probably my size, trying to hold down and contain a 135-pound young man who was full of anger and rage. And it took us 20 minutes. And I just kept thinking to myself, they didn't teach this to me in undergrad. Where is this coming from? Like, what is this all about? So it was years later that I ended up doing some reading and read a book called Children Who See Too Much by Betsy McAllister Grove. Some of you know that. Another book by Bruce Perry called The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, and some recent work that he did with Oprah, which was What Happened to You. So let's talk about stress and trauma, because I've been thinking about it, and I think a lot of people are talking about now, particularly what's going on with COVID, but I think we're also raising the awareness. We used to think that all kids they're just resilient and they're going to bounce back and it's just going to happen, and they're experiencing these difficult, stressful, traumatic situations, and they're probably not even going to know what happened. And that's clearly not what we're seeing. So when we talk about stress, there's certain kinds of stress that are going to motivate us. Those of you who are, and I might put myself in this, who are the procrastinators and waited till the 11th hour to get your paper in or to pay those bills or something else. This is some people that would call that positive stress. You got to get to that 11th hour almost. We'll talk about more when we talk about Bruce Perry, but this tolerable stress, it's serious, but it's a temporary response. And the key piece is here that makes it tolerable. Really key piece is that there's supportive relationships in there. Toxic stress is the idea of this prolonged activation of this stress response, cortisol and adrenaline washing the system again and again, and with the absence of those protective relationships. Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, the quote from her says, when you come into the woods and you see a bear, your system gets activated, your stress response system gets activated. And what you see, your adrenaline fires in, and your blood goes to your gut and you're into your muscles, and your eyes widen open and your breath gets bigger and you're ready to fight or flight. And that's a great thing. It's survival. It's part of our kind of genetics, if you will. But what's the sad part about that is what happens when that gets trauma, when that stress response system gets activated every night, because the bear comes home every night and you never know what's going to happen, and it's unpredictable and sometimes intolerable. So we'll now talk about trauma, and as we move on this, I want you to understand that trauma is that it's a traumatic, it's not necessarily the event itself, it's the way that sometimes that event is perceived, and it overwhelms someone's ability to cope. Feelings of helplessness diminish the sense of self and ability to understand a full range of emotion and experience. It almost zones people in. We've all sometimes, hopefully you haven't experienced it, I think at some point in our lives, we've all had some of this kind of traumatic stress, and it is consuming, I think. But we should also understand that, again, and sometimes people perceive traumatic events differently. God forbid two of us are in a traffic accident. One of us may at one point get out of the car and it's wrecked and walk away and say, oh my God, I will never get in a car again. I will never get in the highway again. I will always go the backwards. I just can't even think about it. I'm just too anxious. Someone else may say, in fact, you know what? I think I'm walking away. I'm pretty lucky. I'm feeling like this was not a positive experience, but I can take something from it. So I hope that makes some sense. Next slide, please. This is Dr. Perry's, from him. Again, I can't say enough good things about Dr. Perry. He talks about this unpredictable, this severe and prolonged stress or trauma. And it's, again, creates a vulnerability in the individual. If you look at the other side, you see this predictability, that moderate and controlled. For those of you who work out, fitness, etc., this is really what you're trying to do with your workouts, with your fitness routine. You're trying to do X number of repetitions, X number of sets. It's going to be moderate. You're not going to go to the point where you're going to hurt yourself. It's always controlled. And, you know, again, what does that build over time? It builds resilience. And that's, again, or it builds muscle in that case, to use that example. So yes, kids are resilient, but you see that they're resilient because it's predictable, it's moderate, controlled. And we're also going to see is because they have a caring or supportive adult. What we might use is what some people might refer to as a buffer. Next slide, please.
And something to add on there, Ed, you know, we talk about stress with young people a lot, and I think stress gets a bad rep, and that's why we were pretty intentional about saying that, you know, some levels of stress create that motivation or create that drive, because not all stress is necessarily bad. It's just, you know, the length and the duration, and Ed and I talk about this a lot, like what level of stress, what is that barrier, right, between like just enough or too much. And sometimes it's a, you know, a slippery slope there.
Sure. I think parents, I think coaches, I think mentors, you want to push somebody to the point where you're close to the edge, but you certainly don't want to push them over. But you do want to, because then the next time they're a little bit stronger, they have that more resilience. Again, that which does not destroy me makes me stronger. So now we talk about the ACEs study, and we're going to talk about Robert Ander and Vincent Felitti. Ander worked for the CDC. Felitti worked for Kaiser Permanente. Kaiser Permanente is the kind of Blue Cross, Blue Shield, middle class, upper middle class type of healthcare insurance. They asked about 30,000 people in their 50s and 60s. The first go of this went in 1998. 99. And so what you start to see is they asked 30,000 participants to ask them about, did they have adverse childhood experiences, or hence ACEs in their life? And I'll tell you what those are in a minute. And then what they did was they then paired whether they had 0 ACEs, or in the first round it was 7 ACEs. Now they talk about 10. We'll talk more about that. But then they paired that person with X number of ACEs to what their medical records look like. So they started to compare people's, you know, whether they had blood pressure, coronary heart disease, cancer, mental illness, a number of other illnesses, and you know, substance use disorder, et cetera. This was a really important study. A couple things that you should note about it. It was done in San Diego or Southern California. About 70% of those people were Caucasian, and about 70% had some college experience. So this is not those people, to use that expression, from the other side of town, whatever that was. And so the numbers were, people said the numbers I think were shocking, and I'll show you those. A study I would refer you to, if you're interested in regards to ACEs as it relates to urban, is the Philadelphia ACEs study, which is kind of another landmark or classic. Next slide, please. So, you know, here is just, you know, infogram of what happened with ACEs. So what we begin to see is that with ACEs, it's dose responsive. So in other words, the more ACEs one's had, the more likely they are to have coronary heart disease, intravenous drug use, have intercourse at a far younger age, younger than 15 years old, to develop depression or suicide attempts. Again, you can see those in the upper right-hand corner, I hope. Some of the ACEs that they talked about, again, were the abuse. So it's emotional abuse, physical and sexual abuse. Sexual abuse was approximately 20%. So 1 out of every 5. Now remember, these are people in their 50s and their 60s. Neglect is another one. Again, emotional neglect and physical neglect. One of the ones that's probably reported to most states, Child Protective Services in Massachusetts, we'd say DCF, but neglect is one of the ones most reported. Other household challenges are going to be things like the domestic violence, substance abuse, mental illness, parental separation, and an incarcerated parent, etc. So I would like to go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Kelly, anything you want to add to that infogram?
I was just, really thinking that one of the biggest things it taught us is that ACEs are really common. And I know you already said that, Ed, but, the majority of people that were surveyed reported having at least one ACE in their life. So something that it told us, rather than, just having qualitative data that people have hard stuff in their lives, it gave us quantitative data that really linked these thoughts to what's actually happening.
That's a great point. Yeah, that's a great point. And again, the ACEs you saw were the ACEs that they quantified, but again, the other ACEs they didn't look at were, homelessness. And we have a number of kids, those who work in school systems know about kids who are McKinney-Vento, and those are the kids who are homeless or that's registered and they're bussed in and et cetera. And then there's community violence, and certainly that's going to be different in every community, but some are clearly far more than others. Bullying, let me say this about bullying. I thought that when bullying was really being discussed seriously, and I thought it was well warranted, say 10, 15 years ago, I think we missed some of that bullying by not trying to figure out, was there trauma in either the victim or the bully themselves? And I think that's something that we need to kind of tease back, in my opinion. Teen dating violence was certainly another ACE. Witnessing community school violence, we have had some of you have heard us present before, and we use maps of certain cities, whether we're presenting or it's Brockton or Plymouth or someplace in West Virginia or wherever, and we take a look at where are shots fired, where are the overdoses, where is domestic violence happen. We start to lay that over a map, and then we put in that map school systems, or where are schools located. And I think some of that thing is that's always eye-opening in terms of getting people to understand how really prevalent this is. A death of a parent or sibling. Let me say this because I think this is really important with what's going on with the opioid epidemic, and particularly with fentanyl over the last, say, 4 or 5 years. We have in Plymouth County approximately 1,800 overdoses reversed, and approximately 130 to 140 people who overdose who are parents. And so we have a lot of kids who are missing their parents or their siblings. And so in terms of natural disasters, certainly, again, an example I would use, you can go ahead, yeah, go ahead. The natural example I would use is about 11 or 12 years ago, Haiti had an earthquake, later followed by floods. And, I know this for a fact, the city of Brockton, particularly the Baker School, and who had a lot of trauma training, they absorbed within a matter of 30 days about 225 Haitian children. So just think of that these kids had gone through what they went through in their home country, transported somewhat, I don't know, maybe 2,000 miles, 1,800 miles up to a city in Massachusetts called Brockton, and they were all put in one school. And that school and those teachers did an amazing job in terms of supporting those kids. And I don't say there were no problems, but there were few problems. Systematic depression, again, racism, classism, something we really need to talk about. We really need to spend some time on. And I think we should be doing that. And I hope we do that. Maybe it'd be part of this discussion with you all. And certainly this global pandemic, it added to what was already some stressful situations. Next slide, please.
And just to add on real quick to what you were saying, the bullet about, natural disasters or just relocation of young people, we think of these ACEs on a spectrum, right? And like what might be a really, catastrophic event for one child might not be the same for another child, but I think it's also about perspective and experience. So I was able to do a project for the YMCA where we interviewed a lot of young people about their experience. And we had a high immigrant population, and those young people shared about their experience. But when I worked with a different group, someone shared out about a totally different experience about dropping an ice cream cone earlier that week. And when the little girl was sharing out, it was something that she really had looked forward to, and it was stressful for her. So just thinking about how there's a spectrum of ACEs, and there's a spectrum of experiences, and it's going to be different for every kiddo that you work with.
Right. And let's remember that the ACEs study wasn't to say how many adverse child experiences each child had. It was talking about the ACEs and the long-term effects over a person's lifespan. But what it did was it gave us that insight into the prevalence of trauma in a child's life, or et cetera. So, we talk about collective trauma, examples of collective trauma, and you can see these. It's a significant threat to not only the individual, but to a group. So one would look at certain communities who have been overly stressed. I mean, to me, the obvious example is slavery, quite frankly, but there are other groups who have been, and many other groups who have been oppressed, and that can go from generation to generation. Et cetera. And again, also living in certain socioeconomic situations in terms of groups can be passed on from one generation to the next. Again, the inability to kind of overcome that, because it's incredibly hard. Next slide, please.
And something to add there, Ed, about collective trauma. And I know we'd probably be able to do this a little bit more in a flow if we were in person, but with these Zoom cubes here. But anyways, when we're talking about collective trauma, we now know that every single young person we're working with has experienced a trauma because they've experienced COVID-19, which would fall under the category of collective trauma. So now you don't have to question whether you're working with a young person that's experienced a trauma. They have experienced a collective trauma, and that's going to impact them in some ways that Ed will talk about on this next slide here.
Yeah. So again, studies have shown us that they're greater individual in a collective fear too. Again, within, say, that the cell of whether it's the child and the mother, or the child and the family, or in that neighborhood or the community, et cetera. And of course, we're flattening out. We all used to, way back, and not too many years ago, but back in the day, we all used to live near each other, and we supported each other. So not only do we have the collective trauma, but we also had some supportive systems. Now we've kind of flattened out, haven't we? So we know, used to be back in the day in the triple deckers, grandma lived in the first floor, and aunt and uncle lived on the second. You lived on the third floor, but you all lived together. You experienced things together. You were supporting each other. And now we've kind of flattened out and separated ourselves. And so the collective trauma, though we have it as a group, we also don't have the supports we used to have. And again, so long-term effects, again, of the disease outbreaks that we've had, again, certainly the pandemic of COVID, also SARS and Ebola and other places in the world. You see increases in panic or anxiety, depression, that hopelessness, grief, and a real legitimate, certainly legitimate collective post-traumatic stress disorder. And I believe that there's many, many children. I was very thankful that our family wasn't affected directly by COVID, by the grace of God, but many were, and that was had to be very traumatic and very difficult for all families who went through that. Very, very painful. So 600,000 is a pretty good example of collective trauma. 600,000 people.
And we're in the process right now of getting a lot of information back as far as formal data on how young people are doing, but just our initial feedback. I was in a 7th grade class the other day, and sometimes if you have any experience working with middle schoolers, you'll ask a question and you'll get crickets. But this was not like anything that I've done before as far as presentations, where when I asked the question about how the past year has been, similar to in the icebreaker that we did, answers were the same for young people: stressed, unsure, speaking a lot towards, that lack of control. They didn't know what was happening yet, and that stressed them out. but they were really able to verbalize what was going on with their thoughts and emotions and feelings. And we hope as you know, time keeps going, we'll get more formal data, but we really don't need the formal data to start doing some of these things for kids as caring adults. We're gonna show a quick video right now. Ed, I'm gonna press play on this in a second.
Yeah.
But really, when we talk about trauma in the brain, we talk about it in you know, a lot of different ways, but specifically scientifically, there is an effect biologically on the brain and body that happens when a young person experiences stress over and over and over. So I'm going to play this, and my hope would be that everyone can hear it in theory. So yeah, hold tight, and we're going to start it in 1 second.
Brain development is much more than a story about biology. From the earliest years, relationships with others play a key role in shaping how our brain grows and develops. Early relationships, where there is abuse and neglect, have a long-term impact on children. A brain that has adapted to survive in a threatening or unpredictable world may not work so well in an ordinary environment. This can create what is called latent vulnerability, where early abusive or neglectful experiences with carers put children at greater risk of experiencing mental health problems in the future. For these children, compared to their peers, common experiences like moving to a new school can feel more daunting and stressful. New faces can appear threatening, while positive social cues can be missed. It can be harder to negotiate new social situations and learn to trust new people. Even fun experiences like joining a new sports team can be challenging. Too much focus on potential threat cues can mean missing out on positive social cues such as a playful nudge. Or it causes an overreaction, which leads to an increased risk of conflict and sometimes violence. These reactions can increase the likelihood of generating new stressful events. It's harder to deal with everyday challenges when you feel unconfident and anxious inside, and harder to build and maintain relationships. Over time, this can mean a child loses friends and the support of adults, and so misses out on opportunities to grow and develop. This social thinning can increase the risk of mental health problems in the future. Neuroscience research is beginning to shed new light on how vulnerability unfolds over a child's life. All children need care and stimulation from adults who value them and who show them attention and love. These experiences shape a child's brain development. When children face traumatic experiences like abuse and neglect, their brain adapts to help them cope. We know of changes in 3 different brain systems: the reward, memory, and threat systems. Experiences of domestic violence or physical abuse can lead to hypervigilance, where the brain reacts more to threat. This might help a child stay safe in an early adverse environment, but it can cause problems in more ordinary environments. Hypervigilance can best be understood as a pattern of adaptation, rather than a sign of damage. Abuse and neglect can also mean a world where a child's basic needs for care and attention are not met. This can shape the brain's reward system, the part of the brain that helps us learn about positive aspects of our environment and motivates our behaviour. Over time, the brain's reward system can learn to respond differently to things like positive social cues. Neuroscience studies have also pointed to changes in the autobiographical memory system, our memory of everyday past experiences. Following trauma, negative memories appear to become more salient, which means they become more prominent than positive ones. And everyday memories can also become less detailed. This is a problem because we need to draw on past experiences to help us deal with new social situations. Neuroscience research is showing how childhood trauma can create latent vulnerability, increasing the risk of later mental health problems like anxiety and depression. This vulnerability is not just located in the child, but arises through their relationships. Helping children who have experienced trauma still requires ordinary boundaries and consequences, but it also requires us to step back and reflect and see behaviour that we find challenging in a different light. A child may simply be doing their best to survive now, with brain adaptations from the past. We know a child's brain has the capacity to continue to adapt. For this to happen, they need our help to build and maintain trusted relationships, manage everyday stresses, and prevent new ones from happening. We need to encourage them to try again and believe things can be different. This is far from an easy task and takes time. Science is helping reframe our understanding of childhood trauma. Seeing children's behaviour in a new light can mean we respond differently. But there is much still to learn. Working together, we can develop more effective approaches that promote resilience and recovery. We can help children build trusting relationships and create opportunities for their brains to adapt in new ways.
So I love that clip for a lot of reasons, but something specific that I pulled away from it, and if you pulled something away from it, feel free to drop it in the chat, was that being trauma informed and, you know, considering the impact on the brain and body doesn't eliminate a consequence. It doesn't get rid of the consequence. What it does is it adds a piece in addition to the consequence that, you know, helps the brain readapt to why their response wasn't the right one. And I think that that can be really helpful in a school setting or in a summer camp setting. And Ed, I don't know if you want to add on anything to that.
Yeah, you know, some people we've given this talk and before people have said, why are you making excuses for bad behavior? And I would say, no, I'm not making excuses for bad behavior. I'm just trying to understand the behavior. I would never make excuses, and I would never let someone be held unaccountable, because that's disrespectful to that person who may have been victimized. And again, that's some of these kids that we're talking about. As we see, it becomes like a cycle. So one of the things that I think you raised the point about awareness, I love a quote by Alice Miller when she talks about when we're attuned to kids and we understand what's going on, we become, and we see their trauma and their pain, we become what she calls enlightened witnesses. And I always like that expression. It's a very powerful one in my mind. So how about the next slide?
Yeah, I want to pause real quick. Gab, did we have anything in the chat that came through? Any takeaways from the video, or if not, we can keep moving.
Just that it's a great video, and another attendee said explanation, not excuse.
Right.
I like that. Yeah, definitely leaning towards that explanation, not excuse. Like, why is the behavior happening? Ed, if you want to keep on going.
Yeah, sure. So let's think about kids in a number of different ways, but the first two we'll look at is cognitive and emotional behavioral. So, you know, you're a school teacher, and Johnny, his mother was beat up by her father the night before, or beat up, and the mother was beat up the night before, and no one knows about it. The teacher certainly doesn't know, because we haven't shared that information, and we'll discuss that later. But in regards to the ability of that child to focus or concentrate, and now here comes that 6th grade teacher with the red hair who comes down the aisle and says, so Johnny, where's your homework? This is the 3rd day in a row. Where's your homework?
And she was coming for you, Ed. You know, she was coming down that aisle.
That was that kid. Their ability to recall or remember, to organize, process. Gee, they got so many things going on in their head. They're already processing an awful lot of things. Problem solving, again, planning, looking at sometimes what happens with some of these kids in regards to their planning and problem solving is they think they have a plan. They try to enact it, but what they don't do, they don't get a chance to do, because it hasn't really been taught. It hasn't been an initiative. They don't get a chance to, like, gee, was that the right thing for me to do, the feedback? So sometimes with some of these kids, we then ask them the question, as they're young or middle school, et cetera. Geez, didn't we already talk about this? I thought you said that we were going to try something different. And what happens is they get stuck. Emotionally, behaviorally, boy, this is tough, because they act out not only to authority figures sometimes, but they also act out. And again, I think you saw that little clip with the boy in the pool and his peer group. You know, that can be the kid who he's often on the outside looking in many ways, or they're trying too hard. Again, they're angry. They seem angry and irritable all the time. Teachers talk a lot, Kelly, you know, about self-regulation, the ability to to self-regulate. And they really don't have that ability to stop and focus, kind of catch the breath. And again, maybe that's why now we're starting to see, we've been doing some work and putting mindfulness and yoga and some other things in school. That's the reason for that, right? They're non-compliance and oppositional defiant. They look at some of the adults like you're like all the other adults in my life. You've let me down, or you've hurt me, and say, or hurt my mother, or something else. So they become pretty, kind of antisocial or oppositional. They have difficulty with transitions. They come from one classroom to the other, and they get in the classroom, and the teacher says, "Here's your work, and let's get going," and da 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 da. And they're still back in the last classroom or figuring out what went on in the corridor. And part of that, it would be great if that little 8 or 10-year-old boy could raise their hand and say, "Excuse me, teacher, I'm having a difficult time self-regulating today. Could you start over for me and help me understand?" They're not going to do that. They're going to feel the odd man out again, and they're going to get more angry. And again, we start to see this cycle build. And again, no surprise, self-injurious behavior with either self-medication, in some cases, cutting behavior, eating disorders, etc. School-age children and adolescents are going to be somewhat different. One of the things I really, really want to talk about here between the two, and I'm looking at my time as well, is I really want to understand that there's some kids who they're clearly in front of you, and they're angry, they're sad, they're depressed, they're anxious, etc. And they got a lot going on. And there are other kids who have either been trained or their own insight says, for survival, I need to stay below the radar. I need to not be that kid who acts out, because if they do, I've already been warned. If they come to the house, they're going to take me away, they're going to take my parents away, etc. Or they have a misconception of what's going to happen. And so I think that you can see all these, and I can read them to you, but you can see them as well. I think the kids I really, really think we got to look for are those kids who fly below the radar. They seem to do everything just about right. And so, boy, they don't need any help. They're swimming along fabulously. But in that actuality, they're not doing so well. Not at all. Mm-hmm. Anything of these you wanted to add to, Kelly?
I was just going to point out that for the sake of time, when we follow up, we'll share the link to this video. We're not going to play it for now, but really, I think Ed already hit on it when he said that, often we think of the aggressive child or we think of the defiant child, but really, being in tune with the perfectionist or the withdrawn student. So maybe the student that isn't saying anything at all, or the student who is the overachiever, right? They have everything going right for them on paper, and that might be their best attempt to stay put together, because if they're perfect, then no one notices. Right. So when we're thinking about how do I notice, a child that might have trauma, I think that the full answer is you're never going to get in your role, most likely, a piece of paper that says this child's been traumatized, but we can do our best to kind of read the room and reach our hand out when we think it's appropriate.
Let me just give a shout out, if I can, for the Trauma and Learning Policy Initiative. They have put all these together. It's traumasensitive-schools.org. If you haven't gone to that website, you'd be amazed at what you're going to find there. They've done a great job. Their first book was Helping Traumatized Children Learn. I think it was a seminal piece of work. It's across the country now, but boy, to have it right in our backyard, and to the work they do has really been changing for, I think, not only myself personally, but I think a lot of professionals and parents and hopefully kids.
Awesome. And then we're just going to finish before the break talking a little about caring adults.
Yeah. So, think about the difficult times you've had in your life. And I dare say that you would say there was a couple, 1, 2, 3 adults who changed your trajectory in some way. They added to you, they improved you, they helped you. Sometimes it seems like a pretty subtle kind of thing. It's not spending, they have to spend every weekend with you or hours with you at a time. That's important. But what's also really important is some of those little moments. So, for instance, I'll give you an example. We do a lot of work with police officers and firefighters and first responders, because unfortunately they go to some scenes which are pretty horrendous, and children are present. they're reluctant for many times to engage those kids. And what we're saying to those, hey, let us give you some tools in your tool belt, because you could be that caring adult at that crisis moment for that child that could make that child understand that there are people who care about him, that he is valued, and he has worth, etc. And again, we get back to that discussion about those who become buffeters. It's not that you have to spend a ton of time in regards to those kids, but it's that important being present at that moment for them. Kelly, you're going to add to this. Oh yeah, so every kid is a one caring adult for being a success story. Really, really like that. And again, we see parent and guardians are certainly first, but boy, I've had kids who said to me, "Hey, Jacobs, I got aces. I got I'm 8 out of 10, and I'm here. I'm alive. I made it to college, or I'm a success in this part of my world, et cetera, et cetera. I made it. So and then all I say to them is, okay, can you look back and really look back? Who was that person or persons who got you across the other side? Who was that person? And I think we all have those. At least I certainly know I do. And I would venture to say almost all of you do. And I'd be surprised if you said I did it all by myself. So.
And something I love about caring adults is that, you don't need any letters after your name. You don't need a formal title. You don't need anything. You don't need a certain profession to be a caring adult. A caring adult can be anybody, as long as they have a, want to be a positive role model or mentor in the life of a young person. They can be. And that doesn't mean that they have to be a parent or they have to have any specific skill set in that area. They just need to want to do well by young people.
Right.
So we are going to take a quick break. If you need a minute to,
5 minutes.
run to the bathroom, do what you need to do. So we will get back together with each other. Let's say like between 3:53, 3:55. So if you want to just take a couple minutes here and we'll be back after the break. All right, for the sake of time, we're going to keep moving along. The next part of our presentation, so we're going to kind of shift. The beginning was really meant to give some information on what trauma was, what the ACEs study was, what trauma looked like in young people and how you could pinpoint it. The second half is really geared more towards how do we create resiliency in youth and how do we foster resiliency? So the beginning half of this presentation, if we just left you with that, would be a little sad, a little depressing, kind of telling you what trauma is, but then giving you no way out. So we're really hoping in the second half to kind of shift that conversation from asking a young person what's wrong with you to what happened to you. And again, this is not going to be every single situation that you encounter when you're working with a kid, but could be part of it. So when we use that word resiliency, it's a lot to unpack, but when I'm talking with younger kids, I usually use the terminology, how do you bounce back? So think of those two things as synonyms, but resiliency is your ability to withstand adversity and bounce back and grow despite life's downturns. If you take nothing else away from this presentation besides this, you are not born resilient or not. So some people think that, that someone simply is resilient or they are not. This is actually a skill that you can develop and something you can build within yourself. And if we can build it within ourselves, we can help foster and build that in young people. So The Rose That Grew from Concrete is really a great poem by Tupac that I'll share. So did you hear about the rose that grew from a crack in the concrete, proving nature's law is wrong? It learned to walk without having feet. Funny it seems, but by keeping its dreams, it learned to breathe fresh air. Long live the rose that grew from concrete when no one else ever cared. So again, just that, kind of idea that despite the conditions or what you grew up in, you can still become and move towards someone that's resilient. Ed, did you want to add anything on to that definition of resiliency? What it means to you?
No, I like that one. And I think you're going to talk about something you and I have had some conversation about how do we help young people. And we're going to talk about this now with that normalize, validate, educate, and empower. So I'm going to leave this back to you.
Yeah, so really, the question becomes, how can I help? If I know a young person has had these things going on in their life, or I don't, and I'm just trying to create an environment that fosters resiliency or really, teaches a young person to be someone that thrives even when faced with adversity. These are some things we can do. So overall, the words we're going to use kind of to describe are to normalize, to validate, to educate, and to empower. But the first thing that we can do is really create a space to talk about their experience. Again, this might not be whole group in front of everybody in the class. This might be a one-on-one conversation, or it could be with a counselor or an adjustment counselor. But again, by giving them a space to talk about their experience, we acknowledge and validate their feelings, which again is the second bullet up there, but we really let the young person know that what happened to you isn't your fault. And we can really, begin to create a safety net around that experience. Talking honesty to young people about their strengths and their areas of growth are equally as important. And sometimes removing the feeling from it altogether can be helpful. So, when you're looking at a young person's art, instead of saying it's good or bad, telling them which areas you like. Like, I love how you use yellow in that picture. Or I like that you drew, the people on the left side of the drawing. And again, taking feelings sometimes out and acknowledging that it's okay to need to grow in some areas and that adults still have areas to grow in some case scenarios. This is a huge piece of fostering resilience in the place that you work with young people, or even in your own life, is modeling appropriate behaviors from youth. So we, within this group that I work with, often say that little eyes are always watching. So again, what we do and what we model is often the best way to teach young people. I work closely with someone on our staff that when she's de-escalating a situation, she slows down how she's talking and she models breathing. And sometimes just her slowing down in that moment and not having that secondhand stress from the scenario can really de-escalate a young person. Modeling appropriate behavior also looks like, as an adult, admitting when we might have made a mistake, which is not always an easy thing to do. So taking a young person aside and saying, you know what, I thought you were the kid that was talking at the table, but it turns out it was someone else, and I apologize for that. I misread the situation. But sometimes modeling that, drop in our ego and that willingness to be vulnerable can really help when working with young people and fostering resiliency. Anything you want to add so far, Ed? I want to make sure you get a chance to jump in.
I like to think about kids as if you have the experience of working with them long term, is it's you don't have to do it all at once. It's little bits and pieces, and also showing your own vulnerability. The expression I've always heard is you take the one down. You don't. You just kind of, you try to be a little humble with kids so that they go, wow, you don't always have to be in charge, so to speak.
And you might be the first adult in their life that they've seen do that. They might have never seen an adult model that growth. Speaking of growth, talking about growth mindset. So it's really important, and we'll talk about language a little later, but to nurture a growth mindset within the classroom you're working with, or, within the camp group you're working with, or whoever you might be chatting with, is adding the word yet to the end of a sentence almost always makes it growth mindset. For example, if a young person says to you, I can't read, adding the word yet, I can't read yet, makes that whole statement a growth mindset as opposed to a fixed mindset, which would teach a young person that wherever they're at is all they can ever get to, and they don't have the opportunity to grow beyond that. So there's lots of ways to foster a growth mindset. It's great that it's 2021 and that Google and Pinterest are our friends, because just as quickly as you type in how to foster a growth mindset in your classroom, you can find multiple handouts, and we'll follow up with some information on how to do that.
Yeah.
Talking about lessons learned, again, bad situations might happen, but what did the young person take away from that? And this might be something, relatively small on the spectrum of maybe a disagreement they had with the counselor at camp, or maybe a disagreement they had with another young person. Like, how did something potentially positive come out of that situation? These next two bullets, actively checking in with your challenging kids, and I purposely wrote actively checking in with your good kids, because we have a tendency to group kids as the good kids and the bad kids. And I'm from a school of thought that says that there are no good kids and there are no bad kids. There's kids with bad behaviors and there's kids that have good behaviors. And really, as much as you're sometimes pushed to check in with those challenging kids or the high flyers, giving that equal effort to a kid that often doesn't come on your radar because of behavior is just as important. Even if that's just checking in to say good morning or to ask them how their day's going. It can be something really small, again, that makes a big difference. Like Ed said, dropping those breadcrumbs. Offering support, but not jumping in. I know this was a really hard piece to get over for me in the classroom. I wanted to fix everything for my kids and make it all good all the time. But there is often learning in the struggle. So letting them struggle for a little oftentimes creates an ending where, they learn from that experience. And
again, Kelly, sorry to, it's a little bit of what we talked about earlier, that tolerable stress. Tolerable.
And that lack of stress altogether and lack of struggle doesn't always create the learning experience that you need to come out of the other end.
That's right.
I also wanted to chime in and say that anyone within the chat, please add on if you want to, clarify anything that you've done, please feel free. The Zoom world makes it a little hard to share out, but don't hesitate to type in the chat. Encouraging young people to ask for help, sometimes just teaching them how to do that. We forget that sometimes we have to be intentional about teaching that skill. Reframing negative thinking. Again, how can we change wording or change, the way we talk about something to shift it into an experience that we could learn from? Building confidence that things can improve, and letting young people know that they have a lot of experiences that lie ahead of them. And not to invalidate whatever they're going through at that moment, but really to let them know, this won't always be this way forever. And how can we build some skills in you so that if something bad, for lack of better words, comes up, you have a skill set to really work through that. Praising privately when appropriate. Some kids do not like to be the center of attention, and active, praise in
Mhm.
front of the whole class could really, really set them off. But just knowing your group of young people, and a lot of this goes back to having relationships with the young people you're working with, but knowing when to pull someone aside to compliment rather than to do it whole group is really important. And again, you learn that just through knowing that young person and knowing what they tend to be like as a kiddo. And then we often in group settings or amongst, I guess, camp counselors, at least I've done it in the past, we ask kids to wait, but we don't always give them a skill set for waiting.
Mhm.
So what can I do when I'm waiting, right?
Right.
Maybe that's counting all the things in the room that are blue. Maybe that's, looking for anything in the room that's shaped like a triangle. And again, this is different as we get a little older, and with older kids, you're not going to be able to do it the same way. But at least with younger kids, waiting can be hard. So how do we wait, and why are we waiting? And then when it comes to language matters, Ed and I found a few different examples of ways that maybe you can just change your language within your group to make it a little more trauma sensitive. So instead of, be quiet, can you use a softer voice? Or instead of asking the rhetorical question of, do I need to separate you? Could you use a break from each other? So sometimes just the way that we present questions, and again, we can send along these slides afterwards, but the way we use our words sometimes just helps a young person process that setting and scenario. Other examples, instead of saying something like, no crying, do you need some help? Or instead of don't be rude, like, could you work on being polite? So sometimes just inserting positive language can make a big difference on the vibe and the culture that your classroom setting has. And when I say classroom,
Yeah.
applicable to anywhere with kids.
Kelly, just to add, I think
Yes.
when we look at kids, we want to look at them. Are they the problem people, or are they part of the solution? And so we really want to bring them in, and it's certainly a lot nicer to hear some of the stuff on the right side than on the left side. And it's just a matter of, again, being enlightened and a little more informed about what kids are going through.
I was when I was teaching, we had a big PBIS initiative going through to reinforce positive behaviors, and something that I was told was to try to give 4 positives for every 1 negative that you say to a group of young people. And you'll catch yourself a lot when trying to do that and recognizing how much you're maybe not using the best language, because I wasn't always perfect as a classroom teacher. Some of these things came out of my mouth, but always I was working towards shifting that culture to be a little more sensitive to kids that might grow up in settings that are chaotic, and that can be really triggering for them. There are some great examples of actual activities you can do that are centered around social emotional learning. Cheryl Delory, who is our social emotional learning coach for the Plymouth Public School District, does a bunch of great work around social emotional learning, and has sent along some resources that I'll forward along to you if you registered for this event and you're on this call with us today. But sometimes, coping skills and how to relax really takes intentional teaching. So again, on the left, you'll see a star where you have to trace your finger as you breathe in and breathe out to teach a young person what that breathing might look like to calm themselves down. And then on the right, modeling faces that indicate how someone might be feeling.
Can I also just add from the chat, just
Yes.
Something that was sent to the panelists that I think that the group should hear. One attendee said, absolutely, with allowing them to try themselves first. One of my biggest rules in any classroom. And so many times this person has seen teachers do everything for their children, and it creates severe social struggles, and the children don't want to try themselves to do anything. So the attendee said, thank you for that.
Yeah. I agree.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. They don't want to fail, and life is all of that, failing.
Right. And we don't want them to fail, right? Because we're all usually
Right.
helpers that come into this profession, and we don't
Right.
want to see them fail. We don't want to see them struggle. We don't want to see it drop.
Right.
But that wait time, and again, I used to do this the worst when I had a question come up in my class from a student, or when I called on a student, and the time I gave them to think and come up with an answer was very small. And the reason I did that was because I didn't want them to be in front of the group struggling, right? I wanted them to have that question answered in the right way. But really that wait time, sometimes it just takes kiddos that long to come up with that answer or to come up with that thought process.
Mm-hmm.
So this last kind of piece or portion before we move into some resources is really being thoughtful about yourself as a caring adult and thoughtful about what you're doing for yourself so that you can be as effective as possible as a caring adult. You cannot pour from an empty cup. Again, you need to be intentional about filling up your cup so that then you can be that best person for young people, but really for anybody in your life, right? Like if we're not working on filling up our own cup, we're not really effective in the things we're trying to do for other people. It's that analogy of, you know, putting on your oxygen mask first when the plane's going down so that you can help other people around you. A colleague of mine that helped put together this presentation calls it who's packing your parachute, right? How are we being intentional about what's going into our own cup? So listening to your body, whether that's, you know, for sleep, whether that's for, you know, needing to kind of sit down and take a rest, maybe you have a headache, but that's the physical body. Staying physically active, again, this is kind of straightforward, but getting a walk in, getting outside if you need to, getting enough rest was already mentioned. Weaving mindfulness into your day. I'm the queen of saying this and then not necessarily always doing it. But again, mindfulness, whether that's an app you download, maybe Headspace or Calm, but some way to get out of your own thoughts and out of your own brain so that you can, again, rest your mind. Identify your own preferences for personal regulation. This was game changing in my work with young people and still is. We're human beings and we're gonna get stressed out. We're gonna get overwhelmed with young people, but being self-aware enough to know when you need to take a break. So sometimes that would look like for me when I was working with students, like, hey, I'm getting really angry right now and a little agitated, so I'm gonna need to step away for a minute and I'll come back to you. And I would say that to 6th grade students, and at first they'd be kind of like, oh my God, what is this lady talking about? But for me, that was modeling that personal regulation of like, I know I'm getting to the point where I'm not going to be my best self, so let me take a break and come right back to you. And that was always really helpful for me in my own work and still is in my own life. Identify your own coping skills. No one can teach you your coping skills. There's something that you have to, you know, really develop yourself, whether that's taking a long walk, popping in some AirPods and listening to a podcast, whether that's, you know, walking down the street to your favorite coffee shop and getting a coffee. Whatever works for you is going to be your own skill set. But again, 2021, we have the Google machine and there's lots of options for coping skills. Knowing your limits, again, that goes along with a lot of what we've said of knowing when to tap out and just knowing when you're worn down and being aware of that. Like what happens right around the time you know that your cup is almost empty? How does that feel in your body? How does that feel in your mind? Utilizing mental health professionals. So when I speak from Plymouth, we have an awesome referral service that we pay into called Interface that connects you with mental health professionals. That's not necessarily in all of the communities in Massachusetts, but if you check out Interface website, they can lead you to the right place to know if you are funded. If not, working with your primary care physician or someone to identify a mental health professional. I am a huge advocate of therapy, a non-biased person to, you know, talk things out with, and using it in a preventative way, right? Before it becomes unmanageable. Using your professional network as well. So lots of people on this call are examples of that for me, but being able to talk through some of these situations, what you have going on with the young person. And then finally, exploring meditation, intentional relaxation techniques, visualization. So whether that's, you know, when you're getting really stressed out and you sit in your chair and you go through every body part and intentionally calm that muscle set down. There's a direct connection between what happens in our body when we're stressed out and how we can, you know, do things that are intentional to reverse or to slow down that process. Ed, did you want to add anything about self-care?
Well, I wanted to share something that a mentor of mine shared with me in the early part of my career. I think the work with working with kids and people in trauma and families and communities is a really, it's an honor and it's a privilege, but it's sometimes really hard work because you see things and you hear things it's hard to prepare for. So I had a mentor of mine who, when I told him the work I was doing, he said, 80-20, Jacobs, 80-20. And he said, you give 100% of 80% towards your work. That's what you do. And you don't ever give less than that. But that 20% is for you. That's for you and your family or whoever, but don't let that 80% creep into the 20, because after a while, you get burnt out, you get tired, you get angry, you're not doing the job you're going to do, and you shorten your career immensely. So again, all those great ideas you had, and, and there are many more. Again, it is really important to quote unquote, I would say, protect yourself, because we want to give so much of ourselves to people, and that's what we're supposed to do, and that's what we do, and that's the success of it. But it's also draining, and so we also need to protect that reserve, in my opinion. I thought it was
For sure. And I think that leads into sometimes a buzzword, if it's not unpacked the right way, but boundaries and healthy boundaries, and knowing how to set a healthy boundary, and knowing that sometimes, even though it doesn't feel like the right thing to say no, or to create that space between another person or another situation, it might be the best option in that scenario for you to be the most effective in that scenario. So those are just, some of the ways that you can be intentional about creating a trauma-informed or really just a classroom or a space that fosters resiliency. Self-care is really pivotal in that process, taking care of you so that you can then take care of other people. Local resources, some of them are more local than others. So we have Handle with Care Massachusetts. We have the ACEs Connection page that recently became the ACEs Connection Plymouth County page, which would be great to check out. Calmer Choice is an organization that can really help with that piece around mindfulness and coping skills. They offer some workshops. They offer some free workshops, which might be something great to check out. The Trauma and Learning Policy Initiative was pointed out by Ed earlier in the presentation, but a great local resource. The Family Resource Centers, both in Plymouth and Brockton, do amazing work. I can't say enough good things about Melinda and her team, about Anna Curie and her team, and all of the people that work within those organizations. And then we have Interface, which I mentioned earlier. And again, this will be sent in a follow-up so that you'll be able to have these resources to check out. And then on top of, the local organizations, we have some local contact information. So I'm Kelly, and again, Ed co-presented with me, so our information's up there. But also Hillary and her team at the Brockton Area Prevention Collaborative, Caitlin McSweeney, who organizes the Plymouth Area Prevention Collaborative through High Point as well, the Family Center, which I mentioned earlier, Katie, Melinda, and Faith, and all of the people in between. These are all contacts that if you write our numbers down, we'll get back to you. We're all doing the boots on the ground work in Plymouth County, and we love connecting. So we'll send this along, but again, write it down, take a picture if you need to, and we'd love to follow up with you. I did want to be intentional about leaving some space for questions. So right now it's 4:17. We said we'd go to around 4:30. We don't need to if there aren't any questions, but I did want to leave some time for questions. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And if anyone wants to ask a question. My Zoom skills are kind of new, but I'm thinking.
So I'm going to be able to allow the attendees who raise their hand to ask a question. So it looks like they're allowed to talk.
Oh, awesome. Can we go ahead and do that?
Yeah.
Looks like Shoshana. Am I saying that right, Shoshana?
Yes, you are.
Awesome. Hi.
Hi. So I had a quick question for Edward. So you said that one of your that favorite quotes was, I couldn't remember the name, Kelly, but she was saying something about, I'm totally drawing a blank, but I really liked what you said and I wanted to look her up.
Was it the Enlightened Witnesses or?
Yes.
Yeah.
I was just about to add that on.
The great child psychiatrist, Alice Miller, I think.
Okay, Alice Miller. Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Shoshana, you got to know that Ed is great for a quote. He'll come out with them all the time, but we got to, keep our finger on it for him to remember what they are, because he's got a bunch. Thanks for asking, though.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
You can ask a question anonymously in the Q&A section of the webinar or publicly in the chat. And if you don't want to ask it out loud, use the Q&A as well.
I'm going to answer a question that I got the other day, but I'm going to answer it. Someone said, if you could boil it down, it's never simplistic. We should always stay away from that. But if you could, when are you concerned about a child's behavior, when, et cetera? And I believe it's when they have difficulty with living, loving, or learning. So any one of a problem in any one of those areas would cause me to, want to focus in a little bit more on that child. Some of those things are part of life. They're part of life's challenges. But when it's over a longer period of time and it persists and it's intense, I think we need to address that. So again, living, loving, and learning, I think for me are the places where I look out for kids.
Yeah. And I don't know if we said this throughout the training, and if I did, I'm sorry for repeating myself. If I didn't, here we go. But I think that it's important to know that as a caring adult or someone that works in the life of a young person, you don't need to be every service for them, and you don't need to answer every question or every concern. Sometimes your job is to just create a safe space for them to kind of talk and vent about what's going on, and then knowing when to pass that information along to someone that needs to hear it. So sometimes, if a young person isn't a danger to themselves or to someone else, they just want to be heard and they just kind of want to vent out their experience. And sometimes just providing that safe space can be the most pivotal thing you can do for them.
Kelly, you said something earlier about you don't need fancy letters after your name. In some of the schools we've done work in, we've done in many, many schools and thousands of teachers, et cetera. Sometimes it's like the janitor or the cafeteria lady or the crossing guard who the child
bus
has
drivers, paras, all of those people that are seeing them all the time.
It's not like, it's got to go to the school adjustment counselor. The school's like, oh no, those other people are, they're a set of eyes and ears, and they're caring adults. So
awesome. So if we don't have any questions in the Q&A and we don't have any more questions in the chat, we just want to say thank you again for being here. And if you want to follow up with us, please do, and you'll be receiving some information from us with some follow-ups from the presentation. But thank you so much.
great.
And
Appreciate y'all.
Awesome.